and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I direct the creative writing program here at Brookdale, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department. I'm very excited to have on the show today Nicole Cooley. She is the author of 4 collections of poetry and a novel. Her 2 most recent books were published in 2010, and they are called Breach, which is about Hurricane Katrina, and the Alice James Press Kinnereth Gensler award-winning Milk Dress. She directs the MFA program in creative writing and literary translation at Queens College in CUNY, and I'm very excited to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start off talking about actually Afflicted Girls, which is your second book, and also your book with Maureen Cummings, which came out in 2010, called Salem Lessons. They're both about the Salem witch trials, and I kind of wondered what drew you to the subject, not once but twice.
Yes, interesting. Well, as a child growing up in Louisiana, I had a bizarre obsession with the Salem witch trials, which I think was sparked by the fact that my father forced me to read The Crucible when I was 12. And I didn't want to read it, but I loved it, and I became totally engaged and interested in the story of these girls in 1692 who had power in that people believed them when they accused others of being witches. So I read a lot of the kind of preteen novels and texts that exist surrounding the trials as a kid. And then I rediscovered them after I published my first book, Resurrection. I rediscovered that fascination, and it was so interesting to delve back into it. It was completely, it seemed, apart from myself. I'd never really lived in New England, but it pulled me into these communities that I had never been in. I met people who are Wiccan. I met people who are relatives of those who died in the Salem witch trials. I met people who did genealogy, historians, literary critics. And I had historians who would fact-check my manuscript. I went to Salem and met high school students who enacted the story of the trials. It was really, really fun. And I spent a summer researching this book at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. So anyway, I felt I could write this book for the rest of my life. It was so fascinating. I love nothing more than weird archival research and strange church documents and maps and microfilm of gravestone rubbings. And then in the process of working on this, I met Maureen, who also loves those things. And I thought, I don't feel finished with this project. And she had, in fact, come across in the Chelsea flea market these penmanship manuals from Salem. She wanted to work with, and she asked me if I wanted to work on them as well. The penmanship manuals were children from the 19th century in Salem, Massachusetts, copying out these horrifying things like fear proceeds from love, all is evil. And so we ended up working on those as sayings, and I wrote poems that were sparked by them, and she put them together in a handmade book with slate covers with the penmanship inscribed.
And they're numbered. There's only a certain number of them, correct?
Yeah, it was so fun because I went back and wrote poems about the people I hadn't written about in my book, The Afflicted Girls, and the collaborative part of it was also very fun because poetry is so incredibly solitary. So we would go back and forth, and the poems would take on different values and valences just because she would say, well, think about this. And I would have never thought about it because she's coming at it from a visual perspective.
I was going to say, how much did the visual perspective then shape the poems in the end?
A lot. It was really fun to work with her. It was really great. And just I'm always looking for a different spin on a way to enter poetry. You know, Minnie Bruce Pratt says, I think of a poem as a room I want to enter, which is my favorite metaphor for poetry. So I'm always thinking, let's not go in the door, let's break down the drywall, let's go in the window, let's sneak under the baseboard. And I'm always wondering how I can access the world of my own poetry in a new way. This was a great new way to do it.
Well, you talked about research, and I wonder because it's a really rich book. There are those 4 levels of poems, ones which are in the voices of the people who were part of the Salem witch trials. There are poems that are built from the sermons of the time. There are poems about actually being in the archives, looking at the poems, and then about the effect this had. And Milk Dress, your newer book, also has in it, I noticed when I read, kind of selected excerpts from a 1959 scientific article. So I really wonder, because it's more so than many poets, there seems to be lots of research, what role that plays for you.
Yes, Wallace Stevens said poetry is a scholar's art, and I kind of take up his phrase in a new way and think about how much I love scholarly research in poetry. A lot of my poems in my first book were failed grad school papers. that I started researching Lewis Carroll and Alice Liddell, and I got only so far and wrote my paper on something else, but I wrote a bunch of poems about it. And it was really, I love research. I love things outside myself, I guess, because they allow you to find your way back to yourself. No matter how far you think you're going from yourself, you're not really. You may be in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, but truthfully, you're back in middle school in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I grew up. So I love the way the outside brings you to the inside, and I love the way outside material, as I would call it, brings a new language. I think it's really important as a writer, as a poet, to always be inventing a new lexicon and to challenge your thinking about language all the time. And these research projects allow that to happen in interesting ways. That being said, I view the research as a trigger in the Richard Hugo kind of triggering town way, where something that sparks you, but it doesn't have to actually even end up in the poem necessarily. So that in Milk Dress, the Henry Harlow article in Scientific American in 1959 really sparked me. I thought, wow, this is so bizarre. It's about the monkeys, the wire monkeys. Yeah, the wire monkeys, and where will the monkeys, will the actual monkeys go to the wire monkeys with the bottle?
Because they took these newborn monkeys away from their actual mother and created these two models. One was a wire monkey that would give milk, and the other one was the cloth monkey that would give warmth but no milk.
Yeah.
Which is just horrific.
Isn't it horrific?
It's awful.
It's the day before they had careful controls and scientific experiments. I was amazed by it, and I was amazed by the language used in the source text, the 1959 article, which was so kind of clinical and heartbreaking. So that fascinated me. And originally it's now splintered in the book in a sort of a series of sections. Originally it was a full poem, and I wrote it.
Was it?
Yeah. It was a poem called Wire, Mother, Mother, Wire, and I wrote it, and I revised, and something about it still wasn't right. And I noticed that something felt off kilter, and I didn't really read it when I had readings, and I gave it to friends to read, and something was off, so I thought, what if I just broke it up and kind of spread it throughout the book as a structuring device instead of trying to make it this unitary poem that it's not working as?
Well, it works beautifully as that. And actually, as I'm reading it, and I'll be honest, when I get to another one of them, I kind of brace myself. I'm like, okay, what are they doing to the poor monkeys now? A little bit, but it works wonderful as those segments. I wonder, though, if you're doing this research and you're using the Salem witch trials or a scientific study or anything of that sort, the figures in your first book, Resurrection, how much do you feel an obligation to historical accuracy, or is it an obligation to the poem? Do you feel any need there?
That is such a great question. I think about that a lot. I think it varies according to context. For example, I think it would be so wrong to write a book on the Salem witch trials and make it a metaphor for my life, right? Yeah. If you're going to write about people dying and a horrible, religious and cultural and social and political event, you have to be true to it. You better get your facts right. Similarly, with Hurricane Katrina, I think it would be really ethically irresponsible for me to write about Katrina and not have my facts. And to just kind of riff on New Orleans and what I think and all that. I feel like, no, we need to know where the flood wall broke. We need to know what happened. It's very important to get that correct. And then the poem can work from there. So in those two books, historical accuracy to me seems paramount. In Milk Dress, it feels a little different to me because that book is more, I guess I would say, personal.
Yeah.
And so some of the more historical details are used more in the service of the poem. And while much of the book is really about my experience mothering in the post 9/11 New York City, and I certainly want to be true and accurate with those details, much of what really is going on in that book is what was happening inside my apartment, as I struggled to come to grips with teaching students and having an infant at that time. So, yeah, but it's something I think about all the time. And I think also about who has the right to tell these stories. Do I have the right, for instance, to write about New Orleans? I wasn't there during Katrina. I grew up in New Orleans. My parents were there during Katrina. Do I have the right to write about it? Should I write about it? What happens if I don't write about it? I feel an urgency to write about it, but why do I feel that urgency?
Well, a lot of your writing involves in some form of disaster. The Salem witch trials, and not just a natural disaster, but humans doing horrible things to other humans in a way. I mean, you have the Salem witch trials, you have Hurricane Katrina, not just the natural disaster, but the government's just response to the disaster. You have the World Trade Center in there. And even in Milk Dress, the motherhood is its own kind of disaster and yet rebirth at the same time. Is this a theme that, I wonder how it personally arises in you, or is this something you feel as an artist you have an obligation to address?
That's so interesting too. I feel it is it's personal, and I have an obligation both. It's larger and it's smaller and particular to my own experience in the world. For me, growing up in New Orleans, I never thought about the levees breaking. I was one of those people in denial. I didn't worry, and it was only when I became an adult and the levees actually broke open and just flooded 80% of the city, did I see what could have actually gone wrong, growing up in New Orleans and the kind of disasters that could have befallen the city. And then raising a young child during 9/11, raising my second daughter during Katrina, all those things began to kind of come together as a constellation of disasters and became very, very much coterminous with my experience of mothering and teaching, and all of it felt connected to me. And I began to think, what is it about these disasters and the way they frame our experience? What is it about these disasters and technology, the way we can actually watch them unfold on the computer screen, right? Especially most recently with Haiti. Yeah. And what does that mean that we can watch them and can do nothing? What does it mean to be powerless? What can language do as opposed to watching the images on CNN.com? All of these questions became very urgent and very personal at the same time to me in the past, I'd say, 10 years.
Wow. Well, we do have to take a break, but I think that's a great thought to go out on, and we're going to talk about it more when we come back, this idea of language and the power to speak to what are common tragedies. We're going to take a break. I'm talking with Nicole Cooley, and this is the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series. Please join us after the break.
This is Brookdale Community College. You are watching Brookdale Television.
Up, college is hard. Down, those books are heavy.
My sport is football, but my passion is education.
Right up here.
So every year I take promising high schoolers on a college tour
Lights there, darks there.
to show them that higher education means a brighter future. My name is Nnamdi Asamoah. I don't just wear the shirt, I live it.
Find out how you can live united for education. Give, advocate, volunteer. Go to liveunited.org.
Do you wear this?
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I'm talking today with Nicole Cooley, who is the author of 2 new books, Milk Dress and Breach. Before the break, we were talking about this idea of an artist's obligation and the idea of language to voice experience. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. People have said to me, why did you want to write a book on Hurricane Katrina? Was it because, was it to deal with your emotions, for example, about the destruction of the city? And actually, not so much. The book was sparked by an image which made me feel an incredible desire to put language together to describe the experience. A year after the storm, driving through Alabama and Mississippi on my way to New Orleans on Highway 90, which is now called Hurricane Alley, because it's simply a path through destruction. Literally towns in Alabama and mainly Mississippi completely erased, for lack of a better word, as if someone had completely just wiped them out. Biloxi, Mississippi, Waveland, Mississippi, past Christiane, gone. I've never seen anything like it in my life. So driving there with my children in the back seat and my husband, looking at these trees that were stunted, seeing empty front steps with a big sign saying no trespassing and no house, seeing people trying to restake a fence and again, no house. All of this struck me and made me think, oh my gosh, I want to write about this. I want to try to describe this destruction and what's happened and have other people think about what's happened. And I thought to myself, I don't know what will come of it. I don't know if it will be a book. I don't know if it'll be poems, but I feel an urgent need to write about what I'm seeing out this car window on this highway.
Well, that's really interesting, because one of the things I did definitely want to ask you was, looking at your books, you have 2 that focus on the Salem witch trials and very much are about that. Breach is very much about Hurricane Katrina. Milk Dress is very much about motherhood. And it seems like, or I wonder if you approach a writing project saying, I want to explore this subject, in contrast to, I have a random number of poems and I'm going to put them in a book together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My first book was more Resurrection was more the random number of poems, and I began to see themes arise. The Salem Witch Trial book was very much project, and I love as you can tell, I love the idea of the research project book, right? I loved working on that as a project and pulling it together. And Breach was very much a project book. Now, Milk Dress was slightly different, however. The genesis of that book was after I had my daughter in end of 2000, I thought I'd never write anything again. So I began just throwing pieces of paper.
Oh, wait, I have to ask why.
I felt exhausted. I was trying to teach my classes. I had a baby. It was tired. It was a seismic shock. I was one of these people, I mean, who thought they could do anything because they were really good with time. I thought because I could write in many genres, I'd be able to balance my time, have a young child, do my full-time job, it'd be fine. I really thought it would be no problem. I was completely deluded. I believed the baby would sleep quietly while I worked on poems. It was
did not happen?
No, it was wrong on every single level. It was completely absurd, frankly. But so I thought I'd never write anything again. But poet Alicia Ostreicher had said in an essay, while you have a young child, just write everything down and just put it away for later. So I thought, all right, can't write a poem, but I can do that. So I began scrawling things on grocery store receipts, pieces of construction paper, anything, a placemat, and shoving it in a folder. And continuing on with my life, taking care of my first daughter and then having the second. One day I looked over at the folder and realized it was like this high, and I had all this stuff in it, and it was complete junk. But I thought, I could work with this. This is kind of interesting. And then I went and did a bunch of research at the American Museum for Women in the Arts in D.C., which is my favorite museum on earth. And I researched Mary Cassatt, who never showed up in the book. And I researched Mary Cassatt, and something about researching Cassatt and taking more notes on construction paper, filling up the folder, I began to think, wow, I have some poems here. And I began to write from that giant collection of language and ideas and scraps.
So Milk Dress really came out of just recording your experiences at the time as you were going through them. Because there are very definitely common themes throughout. It is a book about motherhood, and the sort of the World Trade Center and Katrina are these tragedies that sort of loom at the edges of the poems a little bit. But so it's really kind of coming from the recording your daily life.
It is, and I can't even tell you how bad most of the stuff in that folder was. I mean, terrible, terrible, terrible. Poetry is the one place in my life where I let myself be messy. And I say to my students, I just said it last night in class, if the worst thing you do all day is write a bad poem, you're having a good day. Sure. No regimes topple, no one dies. You throw in the recycling on the way out of the room. I lower my standards and I'm able to write. So most of the stuff I began writing when I went back to my folder was awful. But then gradually, some of it became not awful. And I thought, oh, this is, this could be interesting. This is something. And I began to sort through it. So it was kind of a frustrating process because I had so much junk to wade through. But I still have that folder, and I go back and look at it, and I see that orange construction paper with that crayon, writing something down with my left hand while doing something else. And it heartens me to think that you can create a poem that way.
Don't you? Actually, isn't there a poem in the book that actually is dedicated to Alicia Ostreicher, and it's actually sort of, you told me to write down once a day.
That was actually dedicated to my friend and colleague Kimiko Hahn. But it springs out of that exact idea. It comes out of that exact idea, which was, on the one hand, the pediatrician's like, write down what your baby does all day, and your baby's not doing much in the early days, right? But you're still faithfully recording all this stuff. And then I'm thinking, this is my writing, This is what I'm writing now, but actually, yes. So then I ripped that out and stuck that in my folder too. Thinking, I guess my philosophy about poetry is you just never know. When I get really have a hard time writing is when I'm thinking, I've got to write a perfect poem. I've got to write a well-wrought urn. I've got to sit and write a beautiful, jeweled poem. Can't do it. But when I say, I've got a postcard, I've got a weird trip I made to a hair museum, and I've got, a weird fact about 1718, okay, I can go with that. I can try to work with something. It seems that I can pull it together and maybe make something. If it doesn't work, no problem.
I was thinking about all the research you do, and for a book like Afflicted Girls or Salem Lessons, what is it? Is it something specific in the research that sparks the poem?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. When I went to the archive to work in Worcester, Massachusetts at the American Antiquarian Society, pretty much everybody there was a historian, and you were in the archive all day. I was a little surprised by this, 9 to 5 with a very quick lunch break. So my old ways of working had to be really radically reconfigured. I began working like the historians worked. I would sit on my laptop and transcribe and type. And it became a great way to work because I would just write down all of the weird things that struck me. And I began to notice what struck me and began to think about what images were interesting and what kind of figures in the trials struck me and record and record. And then I would go back at night and pull out what seemed interesting. And I noticed that certain things in that research I kept returning to. Children, for example, mothers, women, things that had been interesting to me across all of my poems previously. So yeah, I think there's a moment when you're researching where you just sort of have kind of an aha moment or a little click and you think, this could be interesting. I'm going to file this away and see what happens.
With all this research, why no creative nonfiction book? Or have you...
Yeah.
Because you've written fiction as well, too, but no creative nonfiction.
I know, that's such an interesting question, too. I've thought about that because now I'm working on this project that's a book based on strange small museums in the South. I wasn't kidding about the Harem Museum. Locke museums, Ava Gardner museums, these all really exist. Judy Garland museums, purse museums, bottle museums, they're everywhere, right?
That's great.
And they're usually in small rural towns that are nearly extinct. And you go in, there's nothing in the town, but there's a telephone museum because the Bell South factory closed. So it's really amazing. Talk about new language and getting into a new subject matter. But it would be a really great creative nonfiction book, and people have said that. So I was thinking
that would be one of those great coffee table books.
I know. So I don't know what's wrong with me. I cannot make it not be poems. I go in and I meet these docents who, are running a museum no one's visited all day, and we end up talking about the Civil War and about locks and hair and movie stars, and I write it all down. And I still end up making a poem out of it. So to me, ultimately, there's something about poetry that it has a unique relationship to voice and testimony.
Well, it's actually, because that brings me to another question I had, because you do, especially again with the Salem witch trials, have a number of poems that are in a persona's voice. And I was wondering how you discover the voice.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm really interested in persona in general, in my classes and in my own writing. And for me, I thought, okay, in Salem, again, whose voice am I going to take on? It would be absurd to take on everyone's voice. Who really interests me? And one of the people that interested me most was the 4-year-old accused of being a witch, Dorcas Good. And at the time, I didn't have a child, but I knew that if you asked the average 4-year-old if they were a witch, they'd say yes. And if you asked them if their mother was a witch, they would say yes. And that's exactly what happened. So I was fascinated by her. There was almost no information on her. She was a footnote in history. And I began to try to write poems in her voice, only 3 of which are actually in the book, though I wrote about 15. The rest were bad. But she felt like a voice I could inhabit and try to take on. Other voices I tried to inhabit came across very badly and seemed very false. So I think it's a matter of which voices can speak to you and which voices you feel comfortable inhabiting.
Do you worry about, again, I guess, the sense of appropriation, of being in someone's voice, and this is not a fictional character you're creating? Is that something that's in your mind at all at the time?
Absolutely. I worry about that constantly. And with the Katrina book in particular, because there have been all kinds of interesting controversies surrounding writing about Katrina, which have been detailed on the Poetry Foundation blog Harriet recently. And it doesn't feel right to me to take up the voices of people who've suffered through Katrina without their permission in particular, and write about it. But it does feel right to write about my family's experience and to talk about their experience and to talk about my experience of watching from afar, or to use someone's voice with their permission for a line or two in a poem. But it's absolutely would be wrong for me to be speaking for the people of New Orleans and how they've suffered when I wasn't there. I feel that really strongly.
Well, we only have a minute or so left, but I do wonder, how has the book been received? Have you read it down in New Orleans? Or?
Yes, actually. I helped to put together a number of Katrina anniversary events because this was the 5th anniversary, this last August 29th. And it was really, really interesting. We had a great event co-sponsored by Tulane University and the Poetry Society of America, which was wonderful, with 8 poets reading different perspectives. We had events at the Kelly Writers House in University of Pennsylvania, Bryant Park, in Brooklyn, very different reading it around the country in different places. I read in Arizona in conjunction with a art gallery show of current Katrina survivors' stories. So it's been
well received and read from widely.
It's been really great to read from the book and have it out there, and in different
has
contexts.
been great. It has been great. Unfortunately, our show is over, but I wanted to thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you. This was great.
Again, I've been talking with Nicole Cooley, whose new books are Breach and Milk Dress. And thank you for watching the show. If you'd like to know more about the creative writing program here at Brookdale, please check out our website at www.brookdalecc.edu. Thanks for watching.